There we are, ready. Chapter 9. The Sports Continued. The refreshment tent looked very nice. The long table across the centre was covered with a white cloth. Bowls of flowers were ranged down it at regular intervals, and between them plates of sandwiches and cakes and jugs of lemonade and champagne cup. Behind it, against a backdrop of palms, stood the 4 Welsh housemaids in clean caps and aprons, pouring out tea. Behind them again sat Mr. Prendergast, a glass of champagne cup in hand, his wig slightly awry. He rose unsteadily to his feet at the approach of the guests, made a little bow, and then sat down again rather suddenly. "Will you take round the foie gras sandwiches, Mr. Pennyfeather?" said Dingy. "They're not for the boys or Captain Grimes." "One for little me?" said Flossie as he passed. Philbrick, evidently regarding himself as one of the guests, was engaged in a heated discussion on greyhound racing with Sam Clutterbuck. "What price the coon?" he asked as he gave Paul a sandwich. "It does my heart good to see old Prendy enjoying himself," said Grimes. "Pity he shot that kid, though. There's not much the matter with him, to see the way he's eating his tea. I say, this is rather a poor afternoon, isn't it?" "Circulate, old boy, circulate. Things aren't going too smoothly." Nor indeed were they. The sudden ebullition of ill-feeling over the 3-mile race, though checked by the arrival of Mrs. Beast Chetwynd, was by no means forgotten. There were 2 distinctly hostile camps in the tea-tent. On one side stood the Circumferences, Tangent, the Vicar, Colonel Sidebottom, and the Hope Browns. On the other, the 7 Clutterbucks, Philbrick, Flossie, and 2 or 3 parents who'd been snubbed already that afternoon by Lady Circumference. No one spoke of the race, but outraged sportsmanship glinted perilously in every eye. Several parents, intent on their tea, crowded round Dingy and the table. Eminently aloof from all these stood Chokey and Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. Clearly the social balance was delicately poised, and the issue depended upon them. With or without her nigger, Mrs. Beast Chetwynd was a woman of vital importance. "Why, Dr. Fagin," she was saying, "it is too disappointing that we've missed the sports. We've just had the slowest journey, stopping all the time to see the churches. You can't move Chokey once he's seen an old church. He's just crazy about culture, aren't you, darling?" "I sure am that," said Chokey. "Are you interested in music?" said the doctor tactfully. "Well, just you hear that, baby," said Chokey. "Am I interested in music? I should say I am." "He plays just too divinely," said Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. "Has he heard my new records, would you say?" "No, darling, I don't expect he has." "Well, just you hear them, sir, then you'll know. Am I interested in music?" "Now, darling, don't get discouraged. I'll take you over and introduce you to Lady Circumference. It's his inferiority complex, the angel. He's just crazy to meet the aristocracy, aren't you, my sweet?" "I sure am that," said Chokey. "I think it's an insult bringing a nigger here," said Mrs. Clutterbuck. "It's an insult to our own women." "Niggers are all right," said Philbrick. "Where I draw the line is a chink. Nasty, inhuman things. I had a pal bumped off by a chink once. Throat cut horrible it was, from ear to ear." "Good gracious," said the Clutterbuck governess. "Was that in the Boxer revising?" "No," said Philbrick. "Saturday night, Edgware Road. It might have happened to any of us." "What did the gentleman say?" asked the children. "Never you mind, my dears. Run and have some more of the green cake." They ran off obediently, but the little boy was later heard whispering to his sister as she knelt at prayers, "Cut horrible from ear to ear." So that, until quite late in her life, Miss Clutterbuck would feel a little faint whenever she saw a bus that was going to Edgware Road. "I've got a friend that lives in Savannah," said Sam, "and he's told me a thing or two about niggers. Of course, it's hardly a thing to talk about before the ladies, but To put it bluntly, they have uncontrollable passions. See what I mean? What a terrible thing, said Grimes. You can't blame 'em, mind, it's just their nature. Animal, you know. Still, what I do say is, since they're like that, the less we see of them the better. Quite, said Mrs. Clutterbuck. I had such a curious conversation just now. Lord Circumference was saying to Paul, with your bandmaster over there. He asked me whether I should like to meet his sister, and when I said yes, I should be delighted to, he said that would cost £1 normally, but he'd let me have special terms. What can he have meant, Mr. Pennyfeather? Upon my soul, Colonel Sidebottom was saying to the vicar, I don't like the look of that nigger. I saw enough of the Fuzzy-Wuzzy and the Sudan. Devilish good enemy and devilish bad friend. I am going across to talk to Mrs. Clutterbuck. Between ourselves, I think Lady C went a bit far. I didn't see the race myself, but there are limits. Rain ain't doing the turnip crop any good, Lady Circumference was saying. No, indeed, said Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. Are you in England for long? Why, I live in England, of course, said Lady Circumference. My dear, how divine! But don't you just find it too expensive? This was one of Lady Circumference's favourite topics, but somehow she did not feel disposed to enlarge on it to Mrs. Beast Chetwynd with the same gusto as when she was talking to Mrs. Sidebottom and the vicar's wife. She never felt quite at ease with people richer than herself. Well, we all feel the wind a bit since the war, she said briefly. How's Bobby Passmaster? Dotty, said Mrs. Beast Chetwynd, terribly dotty. And he and Chokey don't get on. You'll like Chokey, he's just crazy about England too. We've been round all the cathedrals, and now we're going to start on the country houses. We think we're running over to see you at Castle Tangent one afternoon. Oh, that would be delightful, but I'm afraid we're in London at present. Which did you like best of the cathedrals, Mr. Chokey? Chokey's not really his name, you know. The angel's called Mr. Sebastian Cholmley. Well, said Mr. Cholmley, they were all fine, just fine. When I saw the cathedrals, my heart rose up and just sang with me. I'm sure I'm crazy about culture. You folks think because we're coloured we don't care about nothing but jazz. Why, I'd give all the jazz in the world for just one stone from one of your cathedrals. It's quite true, he would. Well, that's most interesting, Mr. Cholmley. I used to live just outside Salisbury when I was a girl, but little as I like jazz, I never quite as strongly felt about it as that. Salisbury is full of historical interest, Lady Circumference, but in my opinion York Minster is the more refined. Oh, you angel, said Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. I could eat you up every bit. And is this your first visit to an English school? Asked the doctor. I should say not. Will you tell the doctor about the schools I've seen? He's been to them all, even the quite new ones. In fact, he liked the new ones best. They were more spacious. Have you ever seen Oxford? Oh, yes, in fact, I was educated there. Well, you know, I've seen Oxford and Cambridge and Eton and Harrow. That's me all over. That's what I like to see. I appreciate art. There's plenty of coloured people come over here, and I don't see nothing but a few nightclubs. I read Shakespeare, said Chokey. Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear. Ever read them? Yes, said the doctor. As a matter of fact, I have. My race, said Chokey, is essentially an artistic race. We have the child's love of song and colour and the child's natural good taste. All you white folks despise poor coloured man. No, no, said the doctor. Let him say his piece, the darling, said Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. Isn't he divine? You folks all think the coloured man hasn't got a soul. Anything's good enough for the poor coloured man. Beat him, put him in chains, load him with burdens. Here Paul observed a responsive glitter in Lady Circumference's eye. But all the time, that poor coloured man has a soul, same as you have. Don't he breathe the same as you? Don't he eat and drink? Don't he love Shakespeare and cathedrals and paintings of the old masters, same as you? Isn't he just asking for your love and help to raise him from the servitude into which your forefathers plunged him? Oh, say, white folks, why don't you stretch out a helping hand to the poor coloured man? That's as good as you are, if only you'll let him be. My sweet, said Mrs. Beast Chetwynd, you mustn't get discouraged. They are all your friends here. Is that so? Said Chokey. Should I sing them a song? No, don't do that, darling. Have some tea. I had a friend in Paris, said the Clutterbuck governess, whose sister knew a girl who married one of the black soldiers during the war, and you wouldn't believe what he did to her. Joan and Peter, run and see if Daddy wants some more tea. He tied her up with a razor strop and left her on the stone floor one night without food or covering, and then it was over a year before she could get a divorce. Used to cut the tent ropes, Colonel Sidebottom was saying, and then knifed the poor beggars through the canvas. You can see him in Shaftesbury Avenue and Charing Cross Road any night of the week, Sam Clutterbuck was saying. The women just hanging on to them. The mistake was ever giving them their freedom, said the vicar. They were happier and better looked after before. It's queer, said Flossie, that a woman with as much money as Mrs. Beast Chetwynd should wear such dull clothes. That ring didn't cost less than 500, said Philbrick. Let's go and talk to the vicar about God, said Mrs. Beast Chetwynd. Chokey thinks religion's just divine. My race is a very spiritual one, said Chokey. The band had been playing Men of Harlech for over half an hour, and said the doctor, Diana, go and tell them to try something else, will you? I sometimes think I'm getting rather bored with coloured people, Mrs. Beast Chetwynd said to Ladies' Conference. Are you? I have never had the opportunity. I dare say you'd be good with them. They take a lot of living up to. They are so earnest. Who's that dear, dim, drunk little man? That is the person who shot my son. My dear, how too shattering for you. Not dead, I hope. Chokey shot a man at a party the other night. He gets gay at times, you know. It's only when he's on his best behaviour that he's so class-conscious. I must go and rescue the vicar. The station-master came into the tent, crab-like and obsequious. Well, my good man, said the doctor. The young lady I have been telling that no other tunes can we play whatever with the lady smoking at her cigarette, look you. God bless my soul, why not? The other tunes are all holy tunes, look you. Blasphemy. It would be to sing the songs of Sion while the lady at a cigarette smokes, whatever. Men of Harlech is good music for you. Well, that is most unfortunate. I could hardly ask Mrs. Beast Chetwynd to stop smoking. Frankly, I regard this as impertinence. But no man can you ask against his maker to blaspheme, whatever, unless you were to pay him more. £3 for the music is good for one of the blaspheming to look you. Dr. Fagin gave him another £1. The station-master retired, and in a few minutes the silver band began a singularly emotional rendering of In Thy Courts No More Are Needed, Sun by Day and Moon by Night. Chapter 10, Post-Mortem. As the last car drove away, the doctor and his daughters and Paul and Grimes walked up the drive together towards the castle. Frankly, the day has been rather a disappointment to me, said the doctor. Nothing seemed to go quite right in spite of all our preparations. And expense, said Dingy. I am sorry, too, that Mr. Prendergast should have had that unfortunate disagreement with Mrs. Beast Chetwynd's coloured friend. In all the 10 years during which we have worked together, I have never known Mr. Prendergast so self-assertive. It was not becoming of him, nor was it Philbrick's place to join in. I was seriously alarmed. They seemed so angry and all about some minor point of ecclesiastical architecture. Mr. Cholmondeley was very sensitive, said Flossie. Yes, he seems to think that Mr. Prendergast's insistence on the late development of the rood screen was in some way connected with colour prejudice. I wonder why that was. To my mind, it showed a very confused line of thought. Still, it would have been more seemly if Mr. Prendergast had let the matter drop, and what could Philbrick know of the matter? Philbrick is not an ordinary butler, said Dingy. No, indeed not, said the doctor. I heartily deplore his jewellery. I didn't like Lady Circumference's speech, said Flossie. Did you? I did not, said the doctor. Nor, I think, did Mrs. Clutterbuck. I thought her reference to the 5-furlong race positively brutal. I was glad Clutterbuck had done so well in the jumping yesterday. She rather wanders from the point, doesn't she? Said Dingy. All that about hunting, I mean. I don't think Lady Circumference is conscious of any definite divisions in the various branches of sports. I have often observed her, in women of her type, a tendency to regard all athletics as inferior forms of fox hunting. It is not logical. Besides, she was nettled at some remark of Mrs. Cholmley's about cruelty to animals. As you say, it was irrelevant and rather unfortunate. I also resented the references to the Liberal Party. Mr. Clutterbuck has stood 3 times, you know. Taken as a whole, it was not a happy speech. I was quite glad when I saw her drive away. What a pretty car Mrs. Beast Chetwynd has got, said Flossie. But how ostentatious of her to bring her footman. I can forgive the footman, said Dingy, but I can't forgive Mr. Cholmley. He asked me whether I had ever heard of a writer called Thomas Hardy. He asked me to go to Reigate with him for the weekend, said Flossie, in a rather sweet way, too. Florence, I trust you refused. Oh, yes, said Florence sadly. I refused. They went on up the drive in silence. Presently Dingy said, What are we going to do about those fireworks you insisted on buying? Everyone has gone away. I don't feel in the mood for fireworks, said the doctor. Perhaps another time, but not now. Back in the common room, Paul and Grimes subsided moodily into the 2 easy chairs. The fire, unattended since luncheon, had sunk to a handful of warm ashes. Well, old boy, said Grimes, so that's over. Yes, said Paul. All the gay throng melted away. Yes, said Paul. Back to the daily round and cloistral calm. Yes, said Paul. As a beano, said Grimes, I've known better. Yes, said Paul. Lady C is hardly what you might call bonhomous. Hardly. Old Prendy made rather an ass of himself. Yes. Hello, old boy, you sound a bit flat. Feeling the strain of the social vortex? A bit giddy after the gay whirl, eh? I say, Grimes, said Paul, what do you suppose the relationship is between Mrs. Beast Chetwynd and that nigger? Well, I don't suppose she trots around with him just for the uplift of his conversation, do you? No, I suppose not. In fact, I don't mind diagnosing a simple case of good old sex. Yes, I suppose you're right. I'm sure of it. Great Scott, what is that noise? It was Mr. Prendergast. Prendy, old man, said Grimes. You've let down the morale of the common room, a pretty good wallop. Damn the common room, said Mr. Prendergast. What does the common room know about rood screens? That's all right, old boy. We're all friends here. What you say about rood screens goes. They'll be questioning the efficacy of infant baptism next. The Church has never countenanced lay opinions on spiritual matters. Now, if it were a question of food and drink, said Mr. Prendergast, if it were a question of drink, but not infant baptism, just drink, and he sat down. A sad case, brother, said Grimes. A truly sad case, Prendy. Do you realise that in 2 minutes the bell will go for prep, and you're on duty? Ding-dong-dell, pussy's in the well. Prendy, that's irrelevant. I know several songs about bells, funeral bells, wedding bells, sacring bells, sheep bells, fire bells, doorbells, dumbbells, and just plain bells. Paul and Grimes looked at each other sadly. Seems to me, said Paul, that one of us will have to take prep for him tonight. No, old boy, that'll be all right, said Grimes. You and I are off to Mrs. Roberts. Prendy gives me a thirst. But we can't leave him here like this. He'll be all right. Those little beasts can't make any more noise than they usually do. You don't think the old man will find him? Not a chance. The bell rang, and Mr. Prendergast jumped to his feet, straightened his wig, steadied himself gravely against the chimney-piece. There's a good chap, said Grimes gently. Just you trot down the passage to the little boys, and have a good nap. Singing quietly to himself, Mr. Prendergast sauntered down the passage. I hope he's none the worse for this, said Grimes. You know, I feel quite fatherly towards old Prendy. He did give it to that blackamoor about the church architecture, bless him. Arm in arm they went down the main avenue towards the inn. Mrs. Beast Chetwynd asked me to call in on her in London, said Paul. Did she? Wow, just you go. I've never been much of a one for society in the smart set myself, but if you like that sort of thing, Mrs. Beast Chetwynd is the goods, all right. Never open a paper, but there's a photograph of her at some place or other. Does she photograph well? Asked Paul. I should rather think she would. Grimes looked at him narrowly. Fair to middling. Why the sudden interest? Oh, I don't know. I was just wondering. At Mrs. Roberts they found the Llanabba silver band chattering acrimoniously over the division of the spoils. All the afternoon the band and I have led in Men of Harlech and sacred music too, look you, and they will not give me a penny more than themselves, whatever. The college gentleman, whatever, if it is of right, I ask, said the station-master. Me with a sister's support, too, look you. Now, don't bother, old boy, said Grimes, because if you do, I'll tell your pals about the extra £1 you got out of the doctor. The discussion was resumed in Welsh, but it was clear that the station-master was slowly giving up. That's settled him all right. Take my tip, old boy. Never get mixed up in a Welsh wrangle. It doesn't end in blows, like an Irish one, but goes on forever. They'll still be discussing the £3 at the end of term, just you see. Has Mr. Beast Chetwynd been dead long? Asked Paul. I shouldn't say so. Why? I was just wondering. They sat for some time smoking in silence. If Beast Chetwynd is 15, said Paul, that doesn't necessarily make her more than 33, does it? Old boy, said Grimes, you're in love. Nonsense. Smitten, said Grimes. No. The tender passion? No. Cupid's jolly little darts? No. Spring fancies? Love's young dream? Nonsense. Not even a quickening of the pulse? No. A sweet despair? Certainly not. A trembling hope? No. A frisson? A je ne sais quoi? Nothing of the sort. Liar, said Grimes. There was another long pause. Grimes, said Paul at length, I wonder if you can be right. Sure of it, old boy. Just you go in and win. Here's to the happy pair. May all your troubles be little ones. In a state of mind totally new to him, Paul accompanied Grimes back to the castle. Prep was over. Mr. Prendergast was leaning against the fireplace with a contented smile on his face. Hello, Prendy, old wineskin. How are things with you? Admirable, said Mr. Prendergast. I have never known them better. I have just caned 23 boys. Chapter 11. Philbrick continued. The next day, Mr. Prendergast's self-confidence had evaporated. Head-hurting, said Grimes. Well, as a matter of fact, it is rather. Eyes tired, thirsty. Yes, a little. Poor old Prendy. Don't I know. Still, it was worth it, wasn't it? I don't remember very clearly all that happened, but I walked back to the castle with Philbrick, and he told me all about his life. It appears he is really a rich man and not a butler at all. I know, said Paul and Grimes simultaneously. You both knew? Well, it came as a great surprise to me, although I must admit I had noticed a certain superiority in his manner, but I find almost everyone like that. Did he tell you his whole story? About his shooting the Portuguese count and everything? No, he didn't tell me that, said Paul. Shooting a Portuguese count? Are you sure you've got the hold of the right end of the stick, old boy? Yes, I'm sure of it. It impressed me very much. You see, Philbrick is really Sir Solomon Philbrick, the ship-owner. The novelist, you mean, said Grimes. The retired burglar, said Paul. The three masters looked at each other. Oh, boys, it seems to me someone's been pulling our legs. Well, this is the story that he told me, continued Mr. Prendergast. It all started from our argument about the church architecture with the black man. Apparently Philbrick has a large house in Carlton Terrace. Camberwell Green? Chain Walk? Well, I'm telling you what he told me. He has a house in Carlton Terrace. I remember the address well because a sister of Mrs. Rounds was once governess at a house in the same row, and he used to live there with an actress who, I regret to say, was not his wife. I forget her name, but I know it's a particularly famous one. He was sitting in the Athenaeum Club one day when the Archbishop of Canterbury approached him and said that the government was anxious to make him a peer, but that it was impossible while he lived such a life of open irregularity. Philbrick turned down the offer. He is a Roman Catholic, I forgot to tell you, but all that doesn't really explain why he is here. It only shows how important he is. His ships weigh hundreds and hundreds of tons, he told me. Well, one evening he and this play actress were giving a party, and they were playing baccarat. There was a Portuguese count there, a very dark man from the legation. Philbrick said, "The game rapidly became a personal contest between these two. Philbrick won over and over again until the Count had no more money left and had signed many IOUs. Finally, late into the night, he took from the Countess's hand, she was sitting beside him with haggard eyes watching him play, an enormous emerald, as big as a golf ball," Philbrick said. "This had been an heirloom of my family since the First Crusade," the Portuguese Count said. "It is one thing which I had hoped to leave to my poor little son," and he tossed it onto the table. "I will wager it against my new 4-funnel turbine-driven liner called the Queen of Arcady," said Philbrick. "That's not enough," said the Portuguese Countess. "And my steam yacht Swallow, and 4 tugs, and a coaling barge," said Philbrick. All the party rose to applaud his reckless bid. The hand was played. Philbrick won. With a low bow, he returned the emerald to the Portuguese Countess. "For your son," he said. Again, the guests applauded, but the Portuguese Count was livid with rage. "You have insulted my honour," he said. "In Portugal we have only one way of dealing with such an occurrence." Then and there they went out into Hyde Park, which was quite close. They faced each other and fired. It was just dawn. At the feet of the Achilles statue, Philbrick shot the Portuguese Count dead. They left him with his smoking revolver in his hand. The Portuguese Countess kissed Philbrick's hand as she entered her car. "No one will ever know," she said. "It will be taken for suicide. It is a secret between us." But Philbrick was a changed man. The actress was driven from his house. He fell into a melancholy and paced up and down his deserted home at night, overpowered by his sense of guilt. The Portuguese Countess rang him up, but he told her it was the wrong number. Finally, he went to a priest and confessed. He was told that for 3 years he must give up his house and wealth and live amongst the lowest of the low. "That," said Prendergast simply, "is why he's here. Wasn't that the story he told you?" "No, it wasn't," said Paul. "Not the shade of likeness," said Grimes. "He told me all about himself one evening at Mrs. Roberts'. It was like this. Mr. Philbrick, Sr., was a slightly eccentric sort of cove. He made a big pile out of diamond mines while he was quite young, and settled in the country and devoted his declining years to literature. He had 2 kids. Philbrick had a daughter called Gracie. From the start, Philbrick was the apple of the old chap's eye, whilst he couldn't stick Miss Gracie at any price. Philbrick could spout Shakespeare and Hamlet and things by the yard before Gracie could even read The Cat Sat on the Mat. When he was 8, he had a sonnet printed in the local paper. After that, Gracie wasn't in it anywhere. She lived with the servants, like Cinderella, Philbrick said, while he, sensible little beggar, had the best of everything and quoted the classics and flowery language to the old boy upstairs. After he left Cambridge, he settled down in London and wrote away like the blazes. The old man just loved that. He had Philbrick and all his books bound in leather and put him in a separate bookcase with a bust of Philbrick on top. Poor old Gracie found things a bit thin, so she ran off with a young chap in the motor trade who didn't know one end of a book from another, or of a car for that matter, as it turned out. When the old boy popped off, he left Philbrick everything, except for a few books to Gracie. The young man had only married her because he thought the old boy was bound to leave her something, so he hopped it too. That didn't worry Philbrick. He lived for his art, he said. He just moved into a bigger house and went on writing away, 15 to the dozen. Gracie tried to get some money out of him, more than an ounce, but he was so busy writing books he couldn't bother about her. At last she became a cook in a house in Southgate. Next year she died. That didn't worry Philbrick at first. Then, after a week or so, he noticed an odd thing. There was always a smell of cooking all over the house, in his study, in his bedroom, everywhere. He had an architect in who said he couldn't notice any smell and rebuilt the kitchen and put in all sorts of ventilators. Still, the smell got worse. It used to hang about his clothes so that he didn't dare go out. A horrible fatty smell. He tried going abroad, but the whole of Paris reeked of English cooking. That was bad enough, but after a time plates began to rattle around his bed when he tried to sleep at night, and behind his chair as he wrote books. He used to wake up in the night and hear the frizzling of fried fish and the singing of kettles. Then he knew what it was. It was Gracie hunting him. Haunting him, even. He went to the Society for Psychical Research, and they got through a conversation to Gracie. He asked how he could make reparation. She said that he must live among servants for a year and write a book about them. That would improve their lot. He tried to go the whole hog at first and started as a chef. Of course, that wasn't really in his line, and the family he was with got ill, so he had to leave. So he came here. He says the book is moving fast, and that he'll read bits of it to me some day. Not quite the same story as Prendy's, is it? No, it's not. By the way, did he say anything about marrying Diggy? Not a word. He said that as soon as the smell of cooking wore off, he was going to be the happiest man in the world. Apparently, he's engaged to a female poet in Chelsea. He's not the sort of cove I'd have chosen for a brother-in-law, but then Flossie isn't really the sort of wife I'd have chosen. These things happen, old boy. Paul told them about the Lamb and Flag at Camberwell Green and about Toby Crutwell. Do you think that story is true, or yours, or Prendy's? He asked. No, said Mr. Prendergast. Chapter 12. The Agony of Captain Grimes. 2 days later, Beast Chetwynd and Paul were in the organ loft of the Llanhybr parish church. I don't think I'd played that terribly well, do you, sir? No. Shall I stop for a bit? I wish you would. Tangent's foot has swollen up and turned black, said Beast Chetwynd with relish. Poor little brute, said Paul. I had a letter from my mamma this morning, said Beast Chetwynd. There's a message for you in it. Shall I read it? He says. He took out the letter, written on the thickest possible paper. The first part is all about racing and a row she's had with Chokey. Apparently he doesn't like the way she's rebuilt our house in the country. I think it was time she dropped that man, don't you? What does she say about me? Said Paul. She says, by the way, dear boy, I must tell you that the spelling in your last letters has been just too shattering for words. You know how terribly anxious I am for you to get on and go to Oxford and everything, and I have been thinking, don't you think it might be a good thing if we were to have a tutor next holidays? Would you think it too boring? Someone young who would fit in. I thought, with that good-looking young master you said like to care, and how much ought I to pay him? I never know these things. I mean, the drunk one, though, he was sweet. I think he must be you, don't you? I think that must be you, don't you? Said Beast Chetwynd. It can hardly be Captain Grimes. Well, I must think that over, said Paul. It sounds rather a good idea. Well, yes, said Beast Chetwynd doubtfully. It might be all right, only there mustn't be too much of the schoolmaster about it. That man Prendergast beat me the other evening. And there should be no organ lessons, said Paul. Grimes did not receive the news as enthusiastically as Paul had hoped. He was sitting in the common room, fire despondently, biting his nails. Good old boy, that's splendid, he said abstractedly. I'm glad, I am, really. Well, you don't sound exactly gay. No, I'm not. Fact is, I'm in the soup again. Badly? Up to the neck. My dear chap, I am sorry. What are you going to do about it? I've done the only thing. I've announced my engagement. Well, that'll please Flossie. Oh, yes, she's as pleased as hell about it. Damn her nasty little eyes. What did the old man say? Baffled him a bit, old boy. He was just thinking out things at the moment. Well, I expect everything will be all right. I don't see why it shouldn't be. Well, there's a reason I I don't think I told you before, but the fact is I'm already married." That evening Paul received a summons from the doctor. He wore a double-breasted dinner jacket, which he smoothed uneasily over his hips as Paul approached. He looked worried and old. "Pennyfeather," he said, "I have this morning received a severe shock. 2 shocks, in fact. The first was disagreeable, but not wholly unexpected. Your colleague, Captain Grimes, has been convicted before me on evidence that leaves no possibility of his innocence of a crime. I might almost call it a course of action, which I can neither understand nor excuse. I dare say I need not particularize. I discerned Captain Grimes' weakness early on in our acquaintance, and a man of your intelligence and sensibility, living at close quarters with him, can scarcely have done otherwise also. But I had fondly hoped, that I might be spared the unpleasantness of a public denunciation. However, that is all a minor question. I have quite frequently met with similar cases during a long experience in our profession. But what has disturbed and grieved me more than I can moderately express is the information that he is engaged to be married to my eldest daughter. That, Pennyfeather, I had not expected. In the circumstances, it seemed a humiliation I might reasonably have been spared. I tell you all this, Pennyfeather, because in our brief acquaintance I have learned to trust and respect you." The doctor sighed, drew from his pocket a handkerchief of crêpe de chine, blew his nose with every accent of emotion, and resumed. "He is not the son-in-law I should readily have chosen. I could have forgiven him his wooden leg, his slavish poverty, his moral turpitude, and his abominable features. I could even have forgiven him his incredible vocabulary, if only he had been a gentleman. I do hope you do not think me a snob. You may have discerned me in a certain prejudice against the lower orders. It is quite true. I do feel deeply on the subject. You see, I married one of them. But that, unfortunately, is neither here nor there. What I really wished to say to you was this. I have spoken to the unhappy young woman, my daughter, and find that she has no particular inclination towards Grimes. Indeed, I do not think that any daughter of mine would fall as low as that. But she is, for some reason, uncontrollably anxious to be married to someone fairly soon. Now, I should be quite prepared to offer you a partnership in Llanaba to a son-in-law of whom I approved. The income of the school is normally not less than 3,000 a year. That is, with the help of dear Diana's housekeeping and my junior partner, would start at an income of 1,000 and, of course, succeed to a larger share upon my death. 'Tis a prospect that many young men would find inviting, and I was wondering, Pennyfeather, whether by any chance, looking at the matter from a business-like point of view, without prejudice, you understand, fair and square, taking things as they are, for what they are worth, facing facts, whether possibly I wonder if I make myself plain?" "No," said Paul. "No, sir, I'm afraid it would be impossible. I hope I don't appear rude, but no, really, I'm afraid—" "It's quite all right, my dear boy. Not another word. I quite understand. I was afraid that would be your answer." "Well, it must be Grimes, then. I don't think it would have been any use approaching Mr. Prendergast." "It was very kind of you to suggest it, sir." Not at all. Not at all. The wedding shall take place a week today. You might tell Grimes that if you see him. I don't want to have any more to do with him than I can help. I wonder whether it would be a good thing to give a small party." For a moment, a light sprang up in Dr. Fagan's eyes and then died out. No, there will be no party. The sports were not encouraging. Poor little Tangent is laid up, I hear. Paul returned to the common room with the doctor's message. "Hell," said Grimes. "I still hoped it might fall through." "What do you want for a wedding present?" Paul asked. Grimes brightened. What about that binge you promised me and Pendy? All right, said Paul. We'll have it tomorrow. The Hotel Metropole, Crumprydych, is by far the grandest hotel in North Wales. It is situated high and at a healthy eminence overlooking the strip of water that railway companies have gallantly compared to the Bay of Naples. It was built in the ample days preceding the war, with a lavish expenditure on looking-glass and marble. Today it shows signs of wear, for it has never been quite as popular as its pioneers hoped. There are cracks in the cement on the main terrace. The winter garden is draughty, and one comes disconcertingly upon derelict bath chairs in the Moorish court. Besides this, none of the fountains ever plays. The string band that used to perform nightly in the ballroom has given place to a very expensive wireless set, which one of the waiters knows how to operate. There is never any note paper in the writing room, and the sheets are not long enough for the beds. Philbrick pointed out these defects to Paul as he sat with Grimes and Mr. Prendergast drinking cocktails in the Palm Court before dinner. And it isn't as though it was really cheap, he said. Philbrick had become quite genial during the last few days. Still, one can't expect much in Wales, and it is something. I can't live without some kind of luxury for long. I'm not staying this evening, or I'd ask you fellows to dine with me. Philbrick, old boy, said Grimes, me and my pals here have been wanting to have a word with you for some time. How about those yarns you span us about your being a ship owner and a novelist and a burglar? Since you mention it, said Philbrick with dignity, they were untrue. One day you shall know my full story. It is stranger than fiction. Meanwhile, I have to be back at the castle. Good night. He certainly seems quite a swell here, said Grimes, as they watched him disappear into the night, escorted with every obsequy by the manager and the head waiter. I dare say he could tell a story if he wanted to. I believe it's their keys, said Mr. Prendergast suddenly. It was the first time that they had spoken. For 20 minutes he had been sitting very upright in his gilt chair and very alert, his eyes unusually bright, darting this way and that in eagerness to miss nothing of the gay scene about him. What's their keys, Prendy? Why, the things that they get given at the counter. I thought for a long time it was money. Is that what's been worrying you? Bless your heart. I thought it was the young lady in the office you were after. Oh, Grimes, said Mr. Prendergast, and he blushed warmly and gave a little giggle. Paul led his guests into the dining-room. Haven't taught French for nothing all these years, said Grimes, studying the menu. I'll start with some jolly old huître. Mr. Prendergast ate a grapefruit with some difficulty. What a big orange, he said when he had finished it. They do things on a large scale here. The soup came in little aluminium bowls. What price the ancestral silver? Said Grimes. The Manchester merchants on the spree, who sat all around them, began to look a little askance at Paul's table. Someone's doing himself well on bubbly, said Grimes as a waiter advanced, staggering under the weight of an ice pail from which emerged a Jeroboam of champagne. Good egg! It's coming to us. With Sir Solomon Philbrick's compliments to the Captain Grimes and congratulations on his approaching marriage. Grimes took the waiter by the sleeve. See here, old boy, this Sir Solomon Philbrick, you know him well? He's here quite frequently, sir. Spends a lot of money, eh? He doesn't entertain at all. He always has the best of everything himself, sir. Does he pay the bill? I really couldn't say. I'm afraid, sir. Would you be requiring anything else? All right, old boy, don't get sniffy. Only he's a pal of mine, see? Really, Grimes, said Mr. Prendergast, I'm afraid you made him quite annoyed with your questions, and that stout man over there is staring at us in a most marked way. I've got a toast to propose, Prendy. Fill up your glass. Here's to Trumpington, whoever he is, who gave us the money for this binge. And here's to Philbrick, said Paul, whoever he is. And here's to Miss Fagin, said Mr. Prendergast, with our warmest hopes for her future happiness. Amen, said Grimes. After the soup and the worst sort of sole, Mr. Prendergast made a little joke about souls and souls. Clearly the dinner party was being a great success. "You know," said Grimes, "look at it how you will. Marriage is rather a grim thought. The 3 reasons for it given in the prayer book have always seemed to me quite inadequate," agreed Mr. Prendergast. "I have never had the smallest difficulty about the avoidance of fornication, and the other 2 advantages seem to me nothing short of disastrous." "My first marriage," said Grimes, "didn't make much odds either way. It was in Ireland. I was tight at the time, and so was the chaplain. God knows what became of Mrs. Grimes. It seems to me, though, that with Flossie I'm in for a pretty solemn solemnization. It's not what I should have chosen for myself, not by a long chalk. Still, as things are, I suppose it's the best thing that could have happened. I think I've about run out of the schoolmastering profession. I don't mind telling you I found it pretty hard to get another job. There are limits. Now I'm set up for life and no more worry about testimonials. That's something, in fact. That's all there is to be said. But there have been moments in the last 24 hours, I don't mind telling you, when I've gone cold all over at the thought of what I was in for." "I don't want to say anything discouraging," said Mr. Prendergast, "but I've known Flossie for nearly 10 years now, and there isn't anything you could tell me about Flossie that I don't already know. I almost wish it was dingy. I suppose it's too late now to change." "Oh dear," said Grimes despondently, gazing into his glass. "Oh Lord, that I should come to this." "Cheer up, Grimes. It isn't like you to be as depressed as this," said Paul. "Old friends," said Grimes, and his voice was charged with emotion. "You see a man standing face to face with retribution. Respect him, even if you cannot understand. Those that live by the flesh shall perish by the flesh. I am a very sinful man, and my past, my first youth. Who shall pity me in that dark declivity to which my steps inevitably seem to tend? I have boasted in my youth and held my head high and gone on my way careless of consequence, but ever behind me, unseen, stood stark justice with his double-edged sword." More food was brought to them. Mr. Prendergast ate with a hearty appetite. "Oh, why did nobody warn me?" said Grimes in his agony. "I should have been told. They should have told me in so many words. They should have warned me about Flossie. Not about the fires of hell. I'd have risked them. I don't mind risking them again. But they should have told me about marriage. They should have told me that at the end of that gay journey and flower-strewn path were the hideous lights of home and the voices of children. I should have been warned of the great lavender-scented bed that was laid out before me, of the wisteria at the windows, of all the intimacy and confidence of family life. But I dare say I wouldn't have listened. Our life is lived between 2 homes. We emerge for a little into the light, and then the front door closes. The chintz curtains shut out the sun, and the hearth glows with the fire of home, while upstairs our heads are enacted again, the awful accidents of adolescence. There's a home and a family waiting for every one of us. We can't escape, try how we may. It's the seed of life we carry about with us like our skeletons, each of us unconsciously pregnant with desirable villa residences. There is no escape. As individuals, we simply do not exist. We are just potential home builders, beavers and ants. How do we come into being? What is birth? "I've often wondered," said Mr. Prendergast, "what is this impulse of 2 people to build their beastly home? It's you and me, unborn, asserting our presence. All we are is a manifestation of the impulse to family life, and if by chance we have escaped the itch ourselves, nature forces us upon us in another way. Flossie's got that itch, enough for 2. I just haven't. I'm one of the blind alleys off the main road of procreation, but it doesn't matter. Nature always wins. Oh Lord, why didn't I die in that first awful home? Why did I ever hope I could escape?" Captain Grimes continued his lament for some time, and deep bitterness of heart. Presently he became silent and stared at his glass. "I wonder," said Mr. Prendergast, "I wonder whether I could have just a little more of this very excellent pheasant?" "Anyway," said Grimes, "there shan't be any children. I'll see to that." "It has always been a mystery to me why people marry," said Mr. Prendergast. "I can't see the smallest reason for it. Quite happy, normal people. Now, I can understand it in Grimes' case. He has everything to gain by the arrangement, but what does Flossie expect to gain? And yet she seems more enthusiastic about it than Grimes. It has been the tragedy of my life that whenever I start thinking about quite a simple subject, I invariably feel myself confronted by some flat contradiction of this sort. Have you ever thought about marriage? In the abstract, I mean, of course." "Not very much, I'm afraid." "I don't believe," said Mr. Prendergast, "that people would ever fall in love or want to be married if they hadn't been told about it. It's like abroad. No one would ever want to go there if they hadn't been told it existed. Do you agree?" "Do they?" said Prendergast. "I didn't know that. What an extraordinary thing. But then, I had an aunt whose cat used to put its paw up to its mouth when it yawned. A wonderful animal that can be taught that. There's a sea lion at the circus I saw in the paper who juggles with an umbrella and 2 oranges. I know what I'll do," said Grimes. "I'll get a motorcycle." This seemed to cheer him up a little. He took another glass of wine and smiled wanly. "I'm afraid I've not been following you chaps. What you said. I was thinking. What are we talking about?" "Prendy was telling me about a sea lion who juggled with an umbrella and 2 oranges. Why, that's nothing. I can juggle with a whacking great bottle and a lump of ice and 2 knives. Look. Grimes, don't. Everyone is looking at you." The head waiter came over to remonstrate. "Please remember where you are, sir." "I know where I am well enough," said Grimes. "I'm in the hotel with my pal Sir Solomon Philbrick, and he's talking of buying. And I'll tell you this, old boy, if he does, the first person to lose his job will be you, see?" Nevertheless, he stopped juggling, and Mr. Prendergast ate 2 peach melbas undisturbed. "The black cloud has passed," said Grimes. "Grimes is now going to enjoy his evening." "6 days later, the school was given a half-holiday, and soon after luncheon, the bigamous union of Captain Edgar Grimes and Miss Florence Selina Fagan was celebrated at the Llanaba Parish Church. A slight injury to his hand prevented Paul from playing the organ. He walked down the church with Mr. Prendergast, who, greatly to his dismay, had been instructed by Dr. Fagan to give away the bride. "I do not intend to be present," said the doctor. "The whole business is exceedingly painful to me." Everybody else, however, was there, except little Lord Tangent, whose foot was being amputated at a local nursing home. The boys, for the most part, welcomed the event as a pleasant variation to the rather irregular routine of their day. Clutterbuck alone seemed disposed to sulk. "I don't suppose that their children will be terribly attractive," said Beast Chetwynd. There were a few wedding presents. The boys had subscribed a shilling each, and had bought, at a shop in Llandudno, a silver-plated teapot, coyly suggestive of Art Nouveau. The doctor gave them a cheque for £25. Mr. Prendergast gave Grimes a walking stick, because he was always borrowing mine, and dinging rather generously 2 photograph frames, a calendar, and a tray of Benares brassware. Paul was best man. The service passed off without a hitch, for Grimes's Irish wife did not turn up to forbid the banns. Flossie wore a frock of rather noticeable velveteen, and a hat with 2 pink feathers to match. "I was so pleased when I found he didn't want me to wear white," she said, "though of course it might have been dyed afterwards." Both bride and bridegroom spoke up well in the responses, and afterwards the vicar delivered a very moving address on the subject of home and conjugal love. "How beautiful it is," he said, "to see 2 young people in the hope of youth setting out with the Church's blessing to face life together. How much more beautiful to see them when they have grown to full manhood and womanhood, coming together and saying, 'Our experience of life has taught us that one is not enough.'" The boys lined the path from the door to the lich gate, and the head prefect said, 3 cheers for the captain and Mrs. Grimes. Then they returned to the castle. The honeymoon had been postponed until the end of term. 10 days later, and the arrangements for the first days of their married life were a little meagre. You must do the best you can, the doctor had said. I suppose you all wish to share the same bedroom. I think there will be no objection to your both moving into the large room in the West Tower. 'Tis a little damp, but I dare say Diana will arrange a fire to be lighted there. You may use the morning room in the evenings, and Captain Grimes will, of course, have his meals at my table in the dining room, not with the boys. I do not wish to find him sitting about in the drawing-room, nor, of course, in my library. You'd better keep his books and gown in the common room as before. Next term I will consider some other arrangement. Perhaps I could hand over one of the lodges to you, or fit up some of the sitting-room in the tower. I was not prepared for a domestic upheaval. Diana, who was really coming out of the business rather creditably, put a bowl of flowers in their bedroom and lit a fire of reckless proportions, in which she consumed the remains of a deck and 2 of the boys' playboxes. That evening, while Mr. Prendergast was taking prep at the end of the passage, Grimes visited Paul in the common room. He looked rather uncomfortable in his evening clothes. Well, dinner's over, he said. The old man does himself pretty well. How are you feeling? Not too well, old boy. The first days are always a strain, they say, even in the most romantic marriages. My father-in-law is not what you might call easy. Needs thawing gently, you know. I suppose as a married man I oughtn't to go down to Mrs. Roberts. I think it might seem odd on the first evening, don't you? Flossie's playing the piano, Dingy's making up the accounts, the old man's gone off to the library. Don't you think we've got time for a quick one? Arm in arm they went down the familiar road. Drinks are on me tonight, said Grimes. Hello. Then they returned to the castle. No, sorry. The silver band were still sitting there, with their heads together, discussing the division of earnings. Then tell me that married this afternoon you were, said the station master. That's right, said Grimes. My sister never at all you would meet whatever, he continued reproachfully, because that woman you do not look like you. Look here, old boy, just you shut up, you're not being tactful, see? Just you keep quiet. I'll give you all some nice beer. When Mrs. Roberts shut her doors for the night, Paul and Grimes turned back up the hill. A light was burning in the West Tower. There she is, waiting for me, said Grimes. Now, it might be a very romantic sight to some chaps, a light burning in a tower window. I knew a poem about a thing like that once. Forgot it now, though. I was no end for one of poetry when I was a kid. Love and all that. Castle Towers came in quite a lot. Funny how one grows out of that sort of thing. Inside the castle, he turned off down the main corridor. Well, so long, old boy. This is the way I go now. See you in the morning. The baize door swung to behind him, and Paul went up to bed. Paul saw little of Grimes during the next few days. They met at prayers and on the way to and from their classrooms. But the baize door that separated the school from the doctor's wing was also separating them. Mr. Prendergast, now in unchallenged possession of the other easy-chair, was smoking away one evening when suddenly he said, You know, I miss Grimes. I didn't think I should, but I do. With all his faults, he was a very cheery person. I think I was beginning to get on better with him. He doesn't look as cheery as he did, said Paul. I don't believe that life above stairs is suiting him very well. As it happened, Grimes chose that evening to visit them. You chaps mind if I come in for a bit? He asked with unwanted diffidence. They rose to welcome him. Sure you don't mind. I won't stay long. My dear man, we were just saying how much we missed you. Come and sit down. Won't you have some of my tobacco? Said Prendergast. Thanks, Prendy. I just had to come in and have a chat. I've been feeling pretty fed up lately. Married life is not all beer and skittles. I don't mind telling you. It's not Flossie, mind. She's been hardly any trouble at all. In a way, I've quite gotten to like her. She likes me anyway, and that's the great thing. The doctor's my trouble. Never lets me alone, that man. Gets on my nerves. He's always laughing at me in a nasty kind of way and making me feel small. You know the way Lady Circumference talks to the Clutterbucks? Like that. I tell you, I simply dread going into meals in that dining room. He's got a sort of air as though he always knew exactly what I was going to say before I said it, and if it was always a little worse than he had expected. Flossie says he treats her that way sometimes. Does it to me the whole time, damn him. I don't expect he means it, said Paul, and anyway, I shouldn't bother about it. It's not the point. I'm beginning to feel he's quite right. I suppose I am a pretty coarse sort of chap. I don't know anything about art. I haven't met any grand people, and I don't go to a good tailor and all that. I'm not what he calls out of the top drawer. I never pretended I was, but the thing is that up until now it hasn't worried me. I don't think I was a conceited sort of chap, but I felt just as good as anyone else, and I didn't care what people thought as long as I had my fun. And I did have fun, too. And what's more, I enjoyed it. But now I've lived with that man for a week, I feel quite different. I feel half ashamed of myself all the time, and I've come to recognize that supercilious look he gives me in other people's eyes as well. Ah, how well I know that feeling, sighed Mr. Prendergast. I used to think I was popular among the boys, but you know I'm not, and at Mrs. Roberts they only pretended to like me in the hope I'd stand them drinks. I did too, but they never gave me one back. I thought it was just because they were Welsh, but now I see it's because they despised me. I don't blame them. God knows, I despise myself. You know, I used to like to use French phrases a certain amount, things like savoir-faire and je ne sais quoi. I never thought about it, but I suppose I haven't got much of an accent. How could I? I've never been to France except for the war. Well, every time I say one of them now, the doctor gives a sort of wince, as if he's bitten on a bad tooth. I have to think about the whole time now before I say anything, to see if there's any French in it, or any of the other expressions he doesn't think is refined. And then when I do say something, my voice sounds so funny I get in a muddle, and he winces again. Oh boy, it's been hell this last week, and it's been worrying me. I'm getting an inferiority complex. Dingy's like that. She just never speaks now. He's always making little jokes about Flossie's clothes, too. But I don't think the old girl sees what he's driving at. That man'll have me crazy before the term's over. Well, there's only one more week. Was all that Paul could say to comfort him. Next morning at prayer, Grimes handed Paul a letter. Irony, he said. Paul opened it and read, John Clutterbuck and Sons, wholesale brewers and wine merchants. My dear Mr. Grimes, the other day at Sports Day you asked whether there was by any chance a job open for you at the brewery. I don't know if you were serious in this, but if you were, a post has just fallen vacant, which I feel might suit you. I should be glad to offer you to any friend who has been so kind to Percy. We employ a certain number of travellers to go round to various inns and hotels to sample the beer and see that it has not been diluted or in any way adulterated. One junior traveller, who is a friend of mine from Cambridge, has just developed D&Ts and has had to be suspended. The salary is £200 a year with a car and travelling expenses. Would this attract you at all? If so, will you let me know during the next few days? Yours sincerely, Sam Clutterbuck. Just look at that, said Grimes. God's own job and mine for the asking. If that had come 10 days ago, my whole life might be very different. You don't think of taking it now? Too late, old boy, too late. The saddest words in the English language. In break, Grimes said to Paul, Look here, I've decided to take Sam Clutterbuck's job and be damned to the Fagans. His eyes shone with excitement. I shan't say a word to them. I shall just go off. They can do what they like about it. I don't care. Oh, splendid, said Paul. It's much the best thing you can do. I'm going this very afternoon, said Grimes. An hour later, at the end of morning school, they met again. "I've been thinking it over, that letter," said Grimes. "I see it all now. It's just a joke." "Nonsense," said Paul. "I'm sure it isn't. Go and see the Clutterbucks right away." No, they don't mean it seriously. They've heard about my marriage from Percy, and they're just pulling my leg. It's too good to be true. Why should they offer me a job like that, even if such a wonderful job exists?" "My dear Grimes, I'm perfectly certain it was a genuine offer. Anyway, there's nothing to lose by going to see them." No, it's too late, old boy. Things like that don't happen." And he disappeared beyond the baize door. The next day, there was fresh trouble at Llanaba. 2 men in stout boots, bowler hats, and thick grey oversuits presented themselves at the castle with a warrant for Philbrick's arrest. Search was made for him, but it was suddenly discovered that he had already left by morning train for Holyhead. The boys crowded round the detectives with interest and a good deal of disappointment. They were not, they thought, particularly impressive figures as they stood in the hall, fingering their hats and drinking whisky and calling Dingy Miss. "We've been after him for some time now," said the first detective. "Ain't we, Bill?" "Pretty near 6 months. It's too bad his getting away like this. They're getting rather restless at HQ about our travelling expenses." "Is it a very serious case?" asked Mr. Prendergast. The entire school were by this time assembled in the hall. "Not shooting or anything like that?" "No, there ain't been no bloodshed up to date, sir. I ought to tell about it, really, but seeing as you'll all be mixed up in it to some extent, I don't mind telling you that I think he'll get off on a plea of insanity. Loopy, you know." "What's he been up to?" "False pretences and impersonation, sir. There's 5 charges against him in different parts of the country, mostly at hotels. He represents himself as a rich man, stays there for some time living like a lord, cashes a big cheque, and then goes off. Calls himself Sir Solomon Philbrick. Funny thing is, I think he really believes his tale. I've come across several cases like this one time or another. There was a bloke in Somerset what thought he was Bishop of Bath and Wells and confirmed a whole lot of kids. Very reverent, too." "Well, anyway," said Dingy, he went without his wages from here." "I always felt there was something untrustworthy about that man," said Prendergast. "Lucky devil," said Grimes despondently. "I'm worried about Grimes," said Mr. Prendergast that evening. "I never saw a man more changed. He used to be so self-confident and self-assertive. He came in here quite timidly just now and asked me whether I believed that divine retribution took place in this world or the next. I began to talk to him about it, but I could see he wasn't really listening. He sighed once or twice and then went out without a word while I was still speaking. Beast Chetwynd tells me he has kept the whole of his 3rd form. Because the blackboard fell down in his classroom this morning, he was convinced they had arranged it on purpose." "Yes, they often do. But in this case they hadn't. Beast Chetwynd said they were quite frightened by the way he spoke to them. Just like an actor, Beast Chetwynd said." "Poor Grimes, I think he is seriously unnerved. It will be a relief when the holidays come." But Captain Grimes's holiday came sooner than Mr. Prendergast expected, and in a way which few people could have foreseen. 3 days later he did not appear at morning prayers, and Flossie, red-eyed, admitted that he had not come in from the village the night before. Mr. Davies, the station-master, confessed to seeing him earlier in the evening in a state of depression. Just before luncheon, a youth presented himself at the castle with a little pile of clothes he had found on the seashore. They were identified, without difficulty, as having belonged to the captain. In the breast pocket of the jacket was an envelope addressed to the doctor, and in it a slip of paper inscribed with the words, "Those that live by the flesh shall perish by the flesh." As far as was possible, this intelligence was kept from the boys. Flossie, though, was severely shocked at this untimely curtailment of her married life, was firm in her resolution not to wear mourning. "I don't think my husband would have expected it of me," she said. In these distressing circumstances, the boys began packing their boxes to go away for the Easter holidays. And that is the end of part 1.